Plato's Phaedo, a work of immense cultural influence and significance, is a unique hybrid. It supplements and complements the Apologies record of the trial and death of Socrates, describing his death with an account that has a plausible claim to at least rough historical accuracy. However, it's explicitly not an eyewitness account. We note at 59b in the margin numbers that Plato was ill. So Plato tells us he wasn't there. At the same time, as it provides this more or less historical account of the last moments of Socrates' life, it also contains a philosophical dialogue that introduces and develops key Platonic metaphysical doctrines that it seems were more likely to be invented by Plato rather than Socrates. However, there is an ambiguity here, and Plato clearly offers hints in places that this might have been an esoteric doctrine, or that some aspects of the teaching of the Phaedo might have been some esoteric doctrine that Socrates also held. Now, Phaedo is a young follower of Socrates who is portrayed as recounting the final conversation before the death of his great mentor, famously by drinking hemlock as required by his sentence. Socrates was allowed to have a number of his friends present at his demise, and in providing them with encouragement, he also provides philosophical instruction in his last hours. Clearly, a major reason that Plato wrote this account was to testify to the fact that Socrates died happy, nobly, and without fear, but also to provide the philosophical justification for this attitude, to show that Socrates wasn't just irrational or crazy to be facing death in this way, but that he had a solid philosophical underpinning for this. Socrates' position on the desirability of death seems to have radicalized during his long stay on death row, as we might call it. He now seems to think that every man who partakes worthily of philosophy should desire to follow him in death as soon as possible. Yet, he cautions that suicide is wrong, for the gods are our guardians and men are one of their possessions. It's not as simple as just killing yourself and then being happy. Rather, it's that the philosopher in particular, the man who has spent his life cultivating the discipline of philosophy, should be ready and willing and happy to die, particularly at the end of a period of cultivating philosophy in his life. So why should the philosopher in particular be ready and willing to die? Socrates' dialogue is with two of his disciples, Cebes and Simmias, and they're confused. Cebes frames his confusion in terms of this vision of life as being in the service of the gods, and one might imagine then that death would be being free of the servitude to the gods. But since the gods are wiser than men, isn't it wiser to live and stay under their protection? And Socrates replies that actually he expects to join the company of other wise and good gods. So certainly the point of escaping this life isn't to escape the service to the gods, otherwise known as piety, but rather it is to ascend to a state of even greater company with the gods. And not just the gods, but also men, better men than are here in the world of the living. Then Socrates begins the main argument of the Phaedo. Why the man who has spent his life in philosophy should not fear death, but instead meet it with good cheer and hopefulness. In fact, Socrates makes a startling claim on page 170 in our text in the right column. Quote, "The one aim of those who practice philosophy in the proper manner is to practice for dying and death." This expresses the famous view of Socrates and Plato that philosophy is practice or training for death. Philosophy is practice or training for death. And this idea of practice or training evokes the idea of of a rigorous athletic training. Except instead of training for the Olympics, what the philosopher trains for is death. And this, as we'll see, is going to be connected with the practice of asceticism, which translates the Greek word askesis, which is just the word for training, this kind of training. So asceticism has come to mean in the English language the practice of various forms of especially bodily self-denial for the sake of some higher spiritual purpose. That's asceticism. So paradigmatically, a monk will practice asceticism. So Socrates aims to show how philosophy can be this form of training. The first step is to define what he means by death. Death, Socrates proposes, is nothing other than the separation of the soul from the body. Death is the separation of the soul from the body. This is more self-evident to the Greeks than to us, especially modern people, because by soul, or suke, the soul or the suke, I guess I don't need to write that down. We've sort of covered that, I believe. But the soul of the suke, they mean simply whatever principle accounts for the living of a living thing. It's not necessarily a Cartesian soul substance or something like that, if you recollect Descartes' Meditations, that idea. It's whatever principle accounts for the living of a thing. And the notion that the soul dies along with the body was assumed to be a real possibility, as we'll see later on. So that's the first thing to do, is to establish the idea of death as the separation of the soul from the body. The second step is to establish that the true philosopher despises all the pleasures of the body, whether food or drink or sex. Now, it might not have seemed obviously that this should be the case. There was a rigorous strain of asceticism, in this sense, practiced among the Pythagoreans, who very likely influenced Plato in this regard. Philolaus is mentioned in this dialogue. And there's also a connection here between the kind of asceticism practiced perhaps by the Pythagoreans and Hindu and Buddhist asceticism. So Socrates, though, didn't seem to be obviously an ascetic in that sense. He had a reputation as a lover of beautiful youths, as being a great erotic. And Plato has no qualms about his participating in a drinking party, the symposium, which is the next item on our agenda. But in Socrates' case, it seems that he was less susceptible to the weakness of the flesh, as it's known, than other men. And that's the key issue, that asceticism is supposed to be training so as to overcome this weakness of the flesh, this vulnerability to the temptations of the flesh. This view of philosophy is somewhat peculiar to Plato and represents a particular interpretation of Socrates' care of the soul. Plato sets up a dichotomy, an opposition between the body and the soul that's very stark in this dialogue. If you look on page 171, he refers to that in general, man's concern is not with the body, but with, as far as he can, he turns away from the body towards the soul. And such a man frees the soul from association with the body as much as possible. So his reasoning seems to be something like this, that the true philosopher is concerned with the care of the soul. This was Socrates' doctrine, that the true philosopher is concerned with the care of the soul, as we saw in the Apology. And then to care for the soul is not to care for the body. To care for the soul is not to care for the body. Therefore, the philosopher does not care for the body. Therefore, he frees the soul from association with the body as much as possible. So that's the line of thinking that leads you from care of the soul to freedom of the soul from the body. The true philosopher is concerned with the care of the soul. To care for the soul is not to care for the body. It's two different objects. Therefore, the philosopher does not care for the body. Therefore, he frees the soul from association with the body as much as possible. But clearly, this is a line of reasoning with gaps. As it stands, it's fallacious. It's based upon an equivocation and a non sequitur. Because the idea of caring for could mean to promote the health of, or it could mean to regard as important. So I care for something. I can care for something in the way a nurse does, or a doctor, promoting the health of that something. Or I could care for something in the sense of regarding it as important. And of course, these things can be related. It could be that I promote the health of something because I regard it as important. But at the same time, I can regard health as important without promoting the health of something in the way that a nurse or doctor does. I can still regard it as important. And I can promote the health of something without regarding it as important if I'm doing it just in a mercenary way as my job and so forth. So it may be true that it's not the philosopher's job, qua philosopher, to promote the health of the body, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the philosopher must regard the body as unimportant. That seems to be the equivocation. Yes, the philosopher is not concerned. The philosopher is not a physical trainer. The philosopher is not a doctor, but that doesn't mean the philosopher has to regard the body as unimportant, not care for it. And then non sequitur is that the fact, if it is one, that the philosopher regards the body as unimportant, doesn't necessarily mean that he frees the soul from association with the body as much as possible. So I may regard, let's say, the brand tags on my blue jeans as unimportant, but that doesn't necessarily mean I remove the brand tag from each new pair I buy. So there's clearly more to this line of reasoning than just saying the philosopher cares for the soul, therefore the philosopher considers the body to be irrelevant, and therefore he tries to separate the soul from the body. Plato has another line of reasoning here. And that line of reasoning is something like this. It's based on the idea that, first of all, the philosopher pursues the search for knowledge. And the body is an obstacle to the search for knowledge. These are really the two key propositions that lead to Socrates and Plato's doctrine of the necessity for the philosopher of separating the soul from the body. This second point, that the idea that the body is an obstacle to the search for knowledge, this is or can be viewed as one of the seminal statements of Western rationalism. Which would be the theory that true knowledge comes from pure thought alone, separated from the senses. That's rationalism. True knowledge comes from pure thought alone, which is a phrase that Plato uses here. Pure thought alone, separated from the senses. Plato's great rationalistic predecessor was Parmenides, whose central doctrines of the oneness of all reality and the denial of change require its adherents to separate their reason and thought processes from the senses and deny the evidence of the senses in favor of rational arguments alone. Socrates doesn't repeat those arguments here, and so it's immediately unclear what the basis is for his conclusion that, as he says on 171, whenever the soul attempts to examine anything with the body, it is clearly deceived by it. Whenever the soul attempts to examine anything with the body, it's clearly deceived by it. This is one aspect of this idea that the body is an obstacle to knowledge. Socrates' rationalism seems to have a basis, at least in part, in a psychological theory about how the soul functions best. In the bottom of this left-hand column on page 171, he writes, The soul reasons best when none of these senses trouble it, neither hearing, nor sight, nor pain, nor pleasure, but when it is most by itself, taking leave of the body, and as far as possible, having no contact or association with it in its search for reality. Now, why might one hold this view? Plato doesn't say right away. Maybe the most natural reading is that the senses produce distractions that interfere with concentration. It's hard to do math problems for most people when your roommate is playing loud music and so forth. A bit later, he expands on the various problems and troubles caused by the senses. This is beginning the last 4 lines of the right-hand column of page 171, where he says, "As long as we have a body, and our soul is fused with such an evil, we shall never adequately attain what we desire, which we affirm to be the truth. The body keeps us busy in 1,000 ways because of its need for nurture. Moreover, if certain diseases befall it, they impede our search for the truth. It fills us with wants, desires, fears, all sorts of illusions, and much nonsense, so that, as it is said, in truth and in fact, no thought of any kind ever comes to us from the body. Only the body and its desires cause war, civil discord, and battles, for all wars are due to the desire to acquire wealth, and it is the body and the care of it to which we are enslaved which compel us to acquire wealth. And all this makes us too busy to practice philosophy. Worst of all, if we do get some respite from it and turn to some investigations, everywhere in our investigations the body is present and makes for confusion and fear, so that it prevents us from seeing the truth." So in support of this second proposition here, the body is an obstacle to the search for knowledge, Plato seems to be focused on the manifold ways in which the body's frailties impede our soul from thinking, and the way in which its needs distract us and or consume time that could be better spent philosophizing. Following these points about the soul, Plato has Socrates introduce, for the first time in the dialogue, the theory of the forms. So this is on 171, right at the top of the right-hand column. "What about the following, Simmias? Do we say that there is such a thing as the just itself or not? And the beautiful and the good? And have you ever seen any of these things with your eyes? Or have you ever grasped them with any of your bodily senses? I am speaking of all things such as bigness, health, strength, and in a word, the reality of all other things, that which each of them essentially is. The reality of all things, that which each of them essentially is. The beautiful, the good, the just, bigness, smallness, health, strength, the reality, the essence of these things. Have you ever seen those with your bodily senses? No. Is what is most true in them contemplated through the body? Or is this the position? Whoever of us prepares himself best and most accurately to grasp that thing itself, which he is investigating, will come closest to knowledge of it. So, as I've said previously, it seems unlikely that Socrates, the historical Socrates, actually came up with this theory that there is this essence of things, the just, the beautiful, the good with a capital J, B, and G, respectively, and all the rest, the things themselves, the essence. It seems unlikely that Socrates came up with this because of his disavowal of metaphysical speculation. But it does seem likely that his mode of questioning did involve a search for definitions. Definitions can be construed as the search for the one common thing. The one common thing that all the apparently individual things that share a common nature are. So that's this idea of the form. So the form of anything, the form of anything, the form of X in this sense is going to be the one common thing, or reality, as he says, that all the individual things that share the name X are. There we go. The form of X is the one common thing or reality that all the individual things that share the name X are. You can see in this doctrine the influence of Parmenides. The idea that, of course, I mean, you might even add in parentheses all the apparently individual things, right? Or all the apparently separate things. Because this suggests that there's some common unity to all these things that are apparently manifold and diverse and separate. All the different things that share the common name X all are instances or something of the form of X. That's the rather obscure, certainly at this point, suggestion of Plato's theory of the forms. There's one common thing that all the apparently individual things that share a common name, whether it's the name good or beautiful or just or strong or small or large or equal, later on we'll see that they all share some one common form, one common thing that all these different things are. So you can see the influence of Parmenides in Plato's construal of this one common thing in terms of the one single unified being that all things that have a common name are, in some sense. And here Plato seems to take for granted that there are these things. The just itself, the beautiful itself, the good itself, the big itself, health itself, strength itself, and so on. Now, these things, the just, the beautiful, and the good, are imperceptible through the senses. Imperceptible through the senses. These forms are not perceived through the senses. The passage I just recently read makes that clear. So the question is, how do we know there are such things if they're imperceptible through the senses? What's the alternative? So, Plato has Socrates vaguely speak of preparing oneself to be able to perceive these things. But what is that? How does one do it? We know that it involves pure thought alone, but what is that? So what I'm emphasizing here is that it should be confusing at this point what he's talking about. And this throws into question who this we is when he says, we say there are. Normally when Plato has Socrates speaking to an outsider and he says, don't we say this, don't we say that, we refers to we human beings or we Greeks. However, here it seems we might mean we initiates in the true philosophy. We who have been initiated into the true philosophy. Later on, Plato will connect this doctrine of the forms with the idea of the Greek mystery religions, most notably the cult of Dionysus. Plato suggests here that Socrates and his inner circle shared some esoteric philosophical teaching, which was what has been passed down to us as the Platonic theory of the forms. So is that true? Did Socrates say one thing to people who weren't part of his initiated inner circle, and in his inner circle he had this theory of the forms? It could be, there could be a reason to think that Plato is doing the same thing here, perhaps that some of the gospel writers did in attributing various ideas to Jesus, is that they're as esoteric doctrines in the Gospel of Mark, for example. The idea that there's some hidden teaching that Jesus gave to his inside group, his inner circle, that he didn't give to the people at large. In esoteric teaching, this notion of the esoteric refers to a teaching that's only revealed to a person who's initiated into a group and has reached a certain level within that group. The idea of an esoteric mystery teaching certainly, as I suggested, wouldn't have been unknown to Plato, not even unknown to philosophy. It could be that the Pythagoreans had such things. But outside of the realm of philosophy, you have the mystery cults in Greece and elsewhere, where you had to be initiated into the cult before they'd reveal the secrets to you. You see this today very prominently in Scientology, right, where you have to reach a certain level. Usually you have to contribute a certain amount before the secret is revealed to you. So that's this idea of esoteric. Not that I'm associating Plato with Scientology, but there you go. It's part of the continuous tradition. Okay, so Plato concludes that because the body is an obstacle to the search for knowledge, this search can achieve its goal only after the soul has been separated from the body, that is, only after death. Hence, the philosopher will view death in a positive light, as the passageway through which he achieves his goal. While we are alive, we philosophers after a Socratic Platonic vein, according to this dialogue, we philosophers, the true philosophers, must strive as much as possible to free ourselves from the infection and the contamination, in Plato's words, the infection and the contamination of the body. The body is also described as a kind of coffin. Through pleasures we're riveted to the body. So there really is this strong imagery of the body as being this evil, as he says, that is entrapping and imprisoning the soul. Requiring purification. The contamination requires a purification effort. The infection requires a kind of purging that's going to purge the soul of the infection of the body and its evil. Plato conceives of the purification of the soul as a kind of gathering of itself into itself and out of the body. The soul gathers itself into itself and out of the body, as in when we're so absorbed in thought that we utterly forget our bodies, which is something Socrates was known to do. We see an instance of this in the Symposium, where he becomes so absorbed in philosophy he just forgets where he is and what he's doing. This practice of the philosopher of gathering the soul into itself and separating it from the clutches, as it were, of the body is the training for dying, because it trains the soul to anticipate the condition of death, which is its separation from the body once and for all, and it trains the soul to desire this separation as a goal. Hence, the philosopher overcomes the fear of death. This is a crucial Socratic Platonic dialogue doctrine. The philosopher overcomes the fear of death. He fears death least of all, Plato says on page 172 there in the right-hand column. The philosopher fears death least of all. This is a view that was immensely influential culturally and civilizationally, the idea that through philosophy one can train oneself and overcome the fear of death. Socrates' view has the peculiar sounding consequence that the philosopher will not find pure knowledge anywhere other than in Hades. So in other words, if you want pure knowledge, you have to go to hell. Something to contemplate. This is the point at which I would like to introduce the first discussion question. First discussion question. Do you agree with Plato's rationalistic position that perfect knowledge comes from pure thought alone, freed from the senses and the embodied condition of humanity. Why or why not? Once again, first discussion question. Do you agree with Plato's rationalistic position that perfect knowledge comes from pure thought alone, freed from the senses and the embodied condition of humanity? Why or why not? Socrates goes on to note how the virtues are cultivated most readily by those who have disregard for the body. So, going through some of the principal virtues, which would include wisdom, courage, and temperance. He says that the virtue of wisdom is best attained by the one who has knowledge. And we've already established that knowledge is gained to the extent that the soul is separated from the body. And this will be even argued in more detail shortly. So the philosopher practices wisdom most of all. And of course, the philosopher is, by definition, the lover of wisdom. The virtue of courage is most present in those who have the least fear of death. And the philosopher is the one who has the least fear of death. So the philosopher is going to be the most courageous. And the virtue of temperance, that is the virtue of moderation in the appetites, that's what this means. It could be translated as moderation. This is easiest to achieve for those who allow the body's needs and appetites to influence them least of all. And this is once again a characteristic of the philosopher. In fact, Socrates suggests that it's only through the particular motivation of the philosopher that virtue can be obtained in any full-bodied way. Non-philosophers obtain some semblance of these virtues, but only by marshaling the body against the body. And so in a kind of half-hearted way or compromised way, they obtain some semblance of the virtues. So, for example, fear of losing your property if your city's burned to the ground overcomes your fear of the enemy, and so you stand and fight to defend your property and your city. Or appetite for sex overcomes your appetite for food, and so you diet and exercise and so on to get into shape so that you have a better chance of finding a sexual partner, that kind of thing. So in these examples, the body is sort of working against the body, and that's what results in the courage or the temperance. But only the philosopher grounds these virtues in wisdom alone, apart from the needs and desires of the body. And thus only the philosopher has true virtue. And here's where Plato explicitly evokes the mystery religions of the Greeks. This is the right-hand column of 173. He says, "My good Simmias, I fear this is not the right exchange to gain virtue, to exchange pleasures for pleasures, pains for pains, fears for fears, the greater for the less, like coins, but that the only valid currency for which all these things should be exchanged is wisdom. With this, we have real courage and temperance and justice, and in a word, true virtue. With wisdom, whether pleasures and fears and all the things be present or absent. When these are exchanged for one another in separation from wisdom, such virtue is only an illusory appearance of virtue. It is in fact fit for slaves, without soundness or truth. Whereas in truth, temperance and courage and justice are a purging away of all such things, and wisdom itself is a kind of cleansing or purification." So true wisdom, courage, temperance, we include the last of what are traditionally known as the four cardinal virtues, because they are those on which all the other virtues hinge, as it's traditionally known. So cardinal, the word cardinal comes from a word for hinge. So wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice, four cardinal virtues. He says, all these should be rooted in wisdom, which is a kind of cleansing and purification from the body. So you obtain true virtue when you're cleansed and purified from the body, when the soul is cleansed and purified from the body. And then he goes on to connect this with the mystery religions. He says, It is likely that those who established the mystic rites for us were not inferior persons, but were speaking in riddles long ago when they said that whoever arrives in the underworld uninitiated and unsanctified will wallow in the mire, whereas he who arrives there purified and initiated will dwell with the gods. He will return to this point, this view that, of course, is familiar to us as translated through Christianity, which is this idea that if you haven't succeeded in separating yourself from the desires of the body, when you reach the afterlife, you'll be stuck in the mud in the underworld. Whereas if you have achieved the separation of the soul from the body, you will live with the gods. That's what he says here, 173, right-hand column. There are indeed, as those concerned with the mystery say, many who carry the thyrsus, but the Bacchants are few. There are many who carry the thyrsus, but the Bacchants are few. The thyrsus is this little stick. It looks like it's got like a pine cone on it usually, and it's wrapped at the end of a stick, and maybe some ribbons. You can Google it. This is the thyrsus. These were carried by the devotees of Dionysus, who is one of the sort of prototypes of Christ. But the thyrsus, you can see here, I mean, this is a quite obvious phallic symbol, and it symbolizes Dionysus as a sexual god. So his devotees would carry this. You can read about this in Euripides, for example. But this phrase is, there are many who carry this, who, as it were, proclaim themselves as being devotees of Dionysus. Like today, one might say there are many who wear crosses around their necks and medals and so forth. But the Bacchants are few. Right? There are many with rosaries wrapped around their rearview mirrors. But the true Catholics or whatever are few. Incidentally, if that phrase, there are many who carry, but the blank are few sounds familiar, it might remind you of Gospel of Matthew chapter 22, verse 14. Many are called, but few are chosen, which is very possibly, if not probably, a source for the author of Matthew when he wrote that particular line in chapter 22, verse 14. Many are called, but the few are chosen. Before this, I mean, centuries before, Plato had written, many are those who carry the thyrsus, but the Bacchants are few. And this isn't Plato's invention. This is a line that those who are members of the Dionysian mysteries apparently would spout. But it's meant to also capture this idea that you also find in the gospel that the road is wide that leads to hell, but the road is narrow, the narrow path that leads to salvation. And that's Plato's vision as well here. In other words, Plato's vision of a quasi-religious, quasi-mystical practice of philosophy became one of the main influences of the Christian religion. And this is one of the main sources for many of these ideas that became so influential in our civilization through their transformed versions in Christianity. And this is the culmination of the initial statement of what might be justly termed the faith of Socrates, or his version of the mystery religion. So once again, just to summarize, the true philosopher practices the separation of the soul from the body, turning the soul into itself and separating it from the demands of the body, and thereby achieves the kind of virtue that leads to salvation, that leads to an afterlife with the gods as opposed to being mired in the muck of Hades. Now, at this point, Cebes speaks up and gives voice to the more naturalistic and even materialistic view of the soul that I alluded to earlier. The common Greek view of the soul, or psyche, was that it was simply the life principle in the body. So whatever causes the body to hold together and exercise its vital functions, which is still somewhat mysterious to science today, I dare say, enables the body to perform its functions of nutrition and growth and digestion and perception and locomotion and consciousness and thinking and all the rest. whatever that principle is that enables the body to do all these, that enables this meat, right, this flesh and blood to do all these things, or in the case of animals or plants, whatever enables their plant material to do these things. That's the soul. And so it could be a material principle. It doesn't necessarily have to be an immaterial substance that can exist on its own separately from the body. It might be something like the breath, which when it leaves the body is simply dispersed and absorbed by the surrounding environment. And the soul just might be something like that. And this is what Seebees expresses the top left of 174. Socrates, he said, everything else you said is excellent, I think, but men find it very hard to believe what you said about the soul. They think that after it has left the body, it no longer exists anywhere, but that it is destroyed and dissolved on the day the man dies, as soon as it leaves the body. And that on leaving it, it is dispersed like breath or smoke, has flown away and gone, and is no longer anything anywhere. If indeed it gathered itself together and existed by itself and escaped those evils you were recently enumerating, there would be much good hope, Socrates, that what you say is true. But to believe this requires a good deal of faith and persuasive argument. To believe that the soul still exists after a man has died and that it still possesses some capability and intelligence. So Socrates' response to this challenge give us an argument that shows that the soul exists after death. The soul is immortal. His response is to investigate, quote, whether the souls of men who have died exist in the underworld or not, unquote. So let's investigate whether the souls of men who have died exist in the underworld or not. And in conjunction with this response, he introduces what he calls here, quote, an ancient theory that souls arriving there come from here. And then again, that they arrive here and are born here from the dead. In other words, he cites the Pythagorean-inspired theory of reincarnation that we saw Plato use for his theory of recollection in the Meno. Now, in the Meno, Socrates introduced reincarnation not so much as a philosophical theory, but as a religiously sanctioned mystery doctrine. Remember, he said it was derived from the inspired deliverances of certain unnamed priests and priestesses, as well as the poet Pindar. Here, by contrast, he treats reincarnation as a philosophical theory and attempts to construct a rational argument for it. Of course, there's a kind of rational argument based on the connection with recollection in the Meno as well, but here he's treating it much more as something in need of proof, and then he's going to give a systematic proof of. The argument is rooted in a general theory of becoming or change, or coming to be. And this is the principle that everything that has an opposite comes to be from its opposite. Or we might abbreviate this as opposites come from opposites, but let's just keep in mind here the more precise form. Everything that has an opposite comes to be from its opposite. So here, this is the first principle of the argument that's going to lead to his defense of the immortality of the soul. Everything that has an opposite comes to be from its opposite. Initially, this principle appears to be supported inductively from observations. So he says things like, we observe opposites coming from opposites in many cases. The smaller comes from the larger, the weaker comes from the slower. Or rather, it would be better maybe to say that the larger comes from the smaller, thinking about growth, right? The slower or the stronger comes from the weaker. The quicker comes from the slower. The better comes from the worse, sticking on the positive side of things. And so, this suggests inductively that everything that has an opposite comes from its opposite. So these examples of things like, the straightforward case would be you have a small child who's small and weak and slow, and it grows into an adult who's bigger and faster and more intelligent. Or quicker, rather. That was the example. But I think actually on closer examination, it's not really an inductive argument he's making here. The principle is probably better construed as an a priori principle about the nature of becoming. Plato says that those things that have an opposite must necessarily come to be from their opposite. And that suggests that this isn't something that we derive inductively, but somehow it's part of the concept of becoming itself. This is a concept of becoming. Or definition of becoming, we could say. That's what's involved here. So it's a priori, not a posteriori. It's not derived from experience, but it's independent of experience. And it's this restriction in scope. Everything that has an opposite comes to be from its opposite. So it's only limited to those things that have an opposite. And this is an unexplained restriction, but it might be intended to avoid the Parmenidean problems about being coming from nothing. Because if we view the opposite of being as nothing, then it would follow that being comes from nothing. But Parmenides reminds us that nothing comes from nothing. So in order to avoid that, Plato may want to say that nothing is not really the opposite of being here. That would be one reason for this qualification. This principle also smacks a bit of Heraclitus' view of being as the succession and unification of contraries. Right? Remember, Heraclitus emphasized the primacy of becoming, but the becoming was, at least one interpretation, the becoming of things from their opposite. So it's sort of the Heraclitean moment or dimension of Plato's thought here. Second, Socrates observes that in the case of things that undergo change in this way, there are two processes, one in each direction. So in the bottom right corner, page 174, he says, between each of these pairs of opposites, there are two processes, from the one to the other, and then again from the other to the first. Between the larger and the smaller, there is increase and decrease, and we call the one increasing and the other decreasing. And so too, there's a separation and combination, cooling and heating, and all such things, even if sometimes we do not have a name for the process. But in fact, it must be everywhere that they come to be from one another, and that there is a process of becoming from each into the other. So it goes in both directions. The weaker becomes stronger, but the stronger can also become weaker. The cooler becomes hot, but the hot can also become cool, and so on. So this process of everything that has an opposite comes to be from its opposite is going to say it's going to be a two-way process. So we can take note of that. From one opposite to the other, and from the other back to the first. So at this point, he's able to construct an argument, at least a sketch of an argument, if not a complete argument, for reincarnation on page 175, which goes something like this. I'll give my reconstruction, my gloss on it. Premise 1. Everything that has an opposite comes to be from its opposite. Premise 1. Everything that has an opposite comes to be from its opposite, which of course is just our principle. For every pair of opposites P and Q, P comes from Q and Q from P. So we're letting just P and Q be variables, right? So we can spell it out in this way. So this principle's the first premise that I had written before, and we can say for every pair of opposites P and Q, where P and Q are just variables that you can put in any pair of opposites, P comes from Q and Q from P. This is our second principle, the two-way process principle. For every pair of opposites P and Q, P comes from Q and Q from P. And then we just say living and being dead are such a pair of opposites. So let P equal living and Q equal being dead. Hence, living comes from being dead and being dead from living. That's the view. So everything that has an opposite comes to be from its opposite. And this is a two-way process, meaning for every pair of opposites, P and Q, P comes from Q and Q from P. Living and being dead are such a pair of opposites. Hence, living comes from being dead and being dead from living. In short, living and being dead relate to one another somewhat as being awake and being asleep relate to one another. That seems to be the analogy. If the living soul comes from being dead, then it must come, Socrates infers, from the underworld. And this appears to satisfy Plato, at least initially, as a sufficient proof of the reality of the underworld, of the abode of the dead. Plato also envisions a cyclical process that we might call the conservation of souls. The conservation of souls, kind of analogous to here, I'm thinking, of course, of the conservation of energy or matter. That there has to be a constant recycling of souls from the realm of the dead to the realm of the living. Because, he says, quoting on page 175, quote, if everything that partakes of life were to die and remain in that state and not come to life again, everything would have to be dead and nothing alive, unquote. And, of course, there's a question here from our modern perspective of, well, why couldn't that be the case? Why couldn't everything just be dead? But also, even from Plato's perspective, it's not immediately clear why it would be sufficient for just some souls to be reborn and the rest remain dead. Maybe the point is that this couldn't be the case cycle after cycle, with each cycle losing a few additional souls to permanent death. It couldn't be the case without eventually running out of souls, so that at a certain point a kind of balance or confirmation of souls must be reached. So the picture, to kind of visualize this is, you have this realm of the living and the dead, and based upon the argument that whatever's up here has to come from here and whatever's here has to come from down here, you get this view of there being this kind of circuit of souls cycling, right? And the line here represents, of course, the moment of death and the moment of birth. So you have from both directions. This would be birth. This would be death. That's the picture. And this is a kind of eternal process. Living comes from death and death comes from living. It seems like it's possible that the Platonic answer to the question, why couldn't everything just be dead, is that, well, their deadness would sort of have to come from the living. Could it have come from the living at just one time and then everything died and now it just is dead and stays dead? That's an interesting question. But at any rate, this is the picture that he's argued for here, with these little balls being souls that are through birth coming into the living, going to death, going to the underworld, and then recycling. So that's an initial argument for a theory of reincarnation that includes the conservation of souls, because there has to be some souls to recycle in order to give birth to the next generation of souls and so on. Cebes next brings up the associated theory of knowledge as recollection. First, it's notable that he says that this is a theory that Socrates was known to mention frequently. So this implies that Plato at least wants us to believe that the theory of recollection was Socrates' own theory and not an invention of Plato, at least not a complete invention. Second, recollection here is cited as a reason to accept the doctrines of reincarnation and the underworld. The argument that Cebes cites is roughly this. The simple basic idea of it is that knowledge is recollection. Recollection presupposes a prior existence of the soul, and therefore there is a prior existence of the soul. Knowledge is recollection. Recollection presupposes a prior existence of the soul, therefore there is a prior existence of the soul. So recollected knowledge, in other words, would be knowledge that was obtained down here below the line, and then that's recollected up here. And why should we accept that knowledge is recollection? First, Socrates cites the demonstration of this provided in the Meno. So he says towards the top second or third paragraph, page 176 on the left-hand column. And this is something Cebes is citing. There is one excellent argument, said Cebes, namely that when men are interrogated in the right manner, they always give the right answer of their own accord, and they could not do this if they did not possess the knowledge and the right explanation inside them. Then if one shows them a diagram or something else of that kind, this will show most clearly that this is the case. And this, of course, is the doctrine of the teaching of the Phaedo, or sorry, of the Meno that's being cited here in the Phaedo, which gives us a pretty clear bit of evidence probably that it was written after, as well as the further development of the doctrines of the Meno. So the Phaedo is quite clearly presupposing and building upon the Meno here, because that's precisely what we saw in the Meno. The slave boy is shown to be recollecting when he's shown the diagram and asked questions and so on. And this is supposed to be a good argument, it says here, for recollection. Recall that in the Meno, the theory of recollection was used as a way to overcome this paradox of inquiry, the notion that inquiry is impossible because either there's no need for it, or else the inquirer would have no notion of what the object of inquiry was, and so inquiry is impossible. In the Phaedo, the theory of recollection is used for a different purpose, to explain how we come to know the forms, and thus to buttress the theory of the forms itself. First, Socrates observes that recollection always comes into play, he says, bottom of the column 176. Recollection always comes into play when a man sees or hears or in some way or other perceives one thing and not only knows that thing, but also thinks of another thing of which the knowledge is not the same but different. So the process Socrates has in mind would be called association by David Hume and later psychologists of the empirical school. In other words, you see the possession of your loved one, and that reminds you of your loved one. A garment or something like that reminds you of the loved one. Or one friend prompts the thought of another who's his constant companion. Bert makes you think of Ernie, and so forth. Socrates introduces a further principle to this. In the next column in the center, he says, when the recollection is caused by similar things, must one not of necessity also experience this, to consider whether the similarity to that which one recollects is deficient in any respect or complete? One must consider, for example, when we say that something is equal, whether we see that we're applying this principle that we're considering the similarity of this equal stick or whatever it may be to something in relation to which the equal stick is deficient. So what's going on here? This leads to an argument that we must have a recollection of a form that preceded anything that we have experienced in this life. And this is the argument that unfolds at some length, 176 and 177. So I'm going to give a reconstruction of the argument that's going on here from the point where I just read through roughly the middle of this right-hand column of 177. The argument is something like this. Premise 1. We realize that there is such a thing as a pair of equals For example, a pair of equal sticks or a pair of equal stones or the like. So premise one, we realize that there is such a thing as a pair of equals. Premise two, every such pair is equal only in a deficient way. That is, no pair of equal sticks or stones are strictly speaking absolutely equal. That is, none are perfectly equal. There's always going to be some, however minuscule, difference or way in which you can distinguish them. So premise two, every such pair is equal only in a deficient way. Premise three, if something has a quality Q, I'm using this as a variable as I was before, so if something has a certain quality, call it Q, only in a deficient way, we are able to realize that it is deficiently Q only if we have prior knowledge of a non-deficient instance of quality Q. So I'll say that again. This is basically the idea in the passage I read. If something has quality Q only in a deficient way, we're able to realize that it is deficiently Q only if we have prior knowledge of a non-deficient instance of quality Q. Premise four, hence we are able to realize that a pair of equals is equal only if we have prior knowledge of a non-deficient instance of the equal. Call this non-deficient instance the equal itself. So premise four, hence we are able to realize that a pair of equals is equal only if we have prior knowledge of a non-deficient instance of the equal. Call this non-deficient instance the equal itself. Premise five, hence we have knowledge of the equal itself, that is prior to our knowledge of all pairs of equal objects. Premise five, hence we have knowledge of the equal itself, that is prior to our knowledge of all pairs of equal objects. And then Socrates completes the argument by demonstrating that this prior knowledge must have come prior to our birth. In other words, this would be premise six. Our knowledge of pairs of equal objects starts from birth. Premise six, our knowledge of pairs of equal objects starts from birth. Premise seven, therefore, knowledge of the equal itself, this is the conclusion rather, not the premise seven. So the conclusion, knowledge of the equal itself can only come by recollecting knowledge of the equal itself that the soul possessed prior to birth. So this is the argument once again. We realize there is such a thing as a pair of equals. For example, a pair of equal sticks or a pair of equal stones or the like. Every such pair is equal only in a deficient way. If something has a quality Q, only in a deficient way, we're able to realize that it is deficiently Q only if we have a prior knowledge of a non-deficient instance of Q. Hence, we're only able to realize that a pair of equals is equal if we have a prior knowledge of a non-deficient instance of the equal, called the equal itself. Hence, we have knowledge of the equal itself that is prior to our knowledge of all pairs of equal objects. But our knowledge of pairs of equal objects starts from birth. Therefore, knowledge of the equal itself can only come by recollecting knowledge of the equal that the soul possessed prior to birth. And this argument doesn't depend upon any special features of the notion of the equal. It can be generalized to cover any instances of concepts that admit of perfect and deficient instances. So as Socrates notes, third large paragraph from the bottom, right-hand column of 177. Therefore, if we had this knowledge and knew before birth and immediately after not only the equal, but the greater and the smaller and all such things, for our present argument is no more about the equal than about the beautiful itself, the good itself, the just, the pious, and as I say, about all those things which you mark with the seal of what it is, both when we are putting questions and answering them. So we must have acquired knowledge of them all before we were born. Here, Plato has a powerful argument both for the reality of the forms and the need for a kind of innate, non-empirical knowledge that he associates with recollection. And the key ideas here in the argument I just went through is that we have concepts that presuppose a perfect instance, but experience gives us no perfect instances. Yet we can recognize the connection between our concepts and objects of experience. And this will lead Plato to the metaphysical view that particular empirical objects are just pale reflections or shadows of the perfect instances of their type, which are the forms that we recollect from a prior existence. As Socrates says on 177, empirical objects are striving to reach the perfect instance, but are falling short of it. It's as if the two equal sticks are striving to reach perfect equality, but are falling short of it because they're only a deficient instance. Notice here that Plato answers a question that seemed very puzzling in the Meno. How can he say that all knowledge is recollection? What about our everyday empirical knowledge? How can that be construed as recollection? And here he seems to answer those very questions. Even our everyday empirical knowledge presupposes a prior knowledge of perfect instances that experience doesn't give us. Empirical things are known through association with those perfect instances. So this leads to the second discussion question. Does Plato's equality argument, as we'll call it, provide a convincing case for the existence of the perfect form of equality and the need to ground all our knowledge in recollection? Why or why not? Second discussion question. Does Plato's equality argument provide a convincing case for the existence of the perfect form of equality and the need to ground all our knowledge in recollection? Why or why not? Okay. Recall that the main argument that Socrates is presenting is a response to the materialistic view of the soul, which says that the soul is not immortal, but undergoes a dispersal or a dissolution with the death of the body, just as the component parts of the body undergo a dispersal or dissolution with the death of the body. Simmias, supposedly on behalf of Cebes, questions whether the argument that established the existence of the soul before birth is sufficient to show that the soul survives the death of the body. On the top of 179, he says, left-hand column, what is to prevent the soul coming to be and being constituted from some other source, existing before it enters a human body, and then, having done so and departed from it, itself dying and being destroyed? And Socrates exists that proof is needed for this. However, this can easily be done, he says, if one combines the conclusion of the pre-existence of the soul with the earlier conclusion of the conservation of the souls that supposedly followed from this idea that opposites must come from opposites. So the idea is something like this. Premise 1. Suppose the soul goes out of existence with the death of the body. Premise 1. Suppose the soul goes out of existence with the death of the body. Premise 2. Then there will be no souls to recycle into new bodies. In other words, on this picture, there'll be nothing here to produce new souls for new bodies. Premise 3, then there will be no dead beings for living beings to come from. But this violates the principle that opposites only come from opposites. Therefore, the soul must continue to exist after the death of the body. Once again, suppose the soul goes out of existence with the death of the body. Then there will be no souls to recycle into new bodies. Then there will be no dead beings for living beings to come from. And that violates the principle that opposites only come from opposites. And therefore, the soul must continue to exist after the death of the body. Notice here there's a background presupposition of this argument that there are new living beings being born. Alternatively, by the way, Plato could have argued this way, that suppose the soul goes out of existence with the death of the body. Then there will be no souls to recycle into new bodies, and if there are no souls to recycle into new bodies, then recollection is impossible. But if recollection is impossible, then knowledge is impossible, because knowledge is recollection. But knowledge is possible, so the soul has to continue to exist after the death of the body. So you see the interrelationship between this doctrine of recollection, reincarnation, and the immortality of the soul, or the survival of the soul after the death of the body. Next, and this is the final point for today, for this first half of the Phaedo, we'll continue with the second half next time. But next, Socrates supplies yet another argument for the survival of the soul based upon its supposed non-composite nature. And the basic structure of this argument, which begins on 179 on the right-hand column, is that destruction is decomposition. Destruction is decomposition. So that would be the first premise of this argument. I'm just giving the basic structure here now. So destruction is decomposition. Premise 2, hence only composite things can be destroyed. Premise 2, only composite things can be destroyed. Premise 3, the soul is not a composite thing. Premise 3, the soul is not a composite thing. Conclusion, therefore, the soul cannot be destroyed. So that's very simple, easy to grasp. Destruction is decomposition. Hence, only composite things can be destroyed. The soul is not a composite thing, hence the soul cannot be destroyed. But what makes this argument interesting is the detour of this argument, which concerns the way in which Socrates proposes to establish that the soul is not a composite thing. He argues that the soul belongs to the class of the invisible things, which is a class that includes the forms. The forms are also invisible things, right? Because they're imperceptible by the senses. So they're invisible things. And the forms are also, he says here, always unchanging and ever the same. They're divine like the gods. And if the soul therefore belongs to the same class as these invisible things, we have reason to think that the soul is also pure and indestructible in this way. And at this point, the argument circles around to its starting place, which is that philosophy is a preparation for death. And we also recoup this interest in the mystery religions and the connection between certain mystery doctrines and this philosophical view. So philosophy is a preparation for death. The more the soul frees itself from the concerns of the body and fixates on the contemplation of the unchanging forms, the more it frees itself really from the body after death. And the result here is strikingly similar to the Eastern notions of karma and samsara. We see on 181, the bottom third of the right-hand column. So he's describing, first of all, the soul that has managed to free itself from the concerns of the body. He says, a soul in this state makes its way to the invisible, which is like itself, the divine and immortal and wise, and arriving there it can be happy, having rid itself of confusion, ignorance, fear, and violent desires, and the other human ills. And, as is said of the initiates, truly spend the rest of time with the gods. And then the contrary case. So that's the blessed, right? This is the blessed and the contrary case of the damned. He says, but I think that if the soul is polluted and impure when it leaves the body, having always been associated with the body and served the body, bewitched by physical desires and pleasures to the point which nothing seems real to it but the physical, which one can touch and see and eat and drink or make use of for sexual enjoyment. And if that soul is accustomed to hate and fear and avoid that which is dim and invisible to the eyes, but intelligible and to be grasped by philosophy, do you think such a soul will escape pure and of itself? This bodily element is heavy, ponderous, earthy, invisible. Through it, such a soul has become heavy and is dragged back to the visible region in fear of the unseen and of Hades. It wanders, as we are told, around graves and monuments, where shadowy phantoms, images, it's a Halloween image here, ghosts, where images that such souls produce have been seen, souls that have not been freed and purified, but share in the visible and are therefore seen. These are not the souls of the good, but of inferior men, which are forced to wander there, paying the penalty for their previous bad upbringing. They wander until their longing for that which accompanies them, the physical, again imprisons them in a body. And they are then, as is likely, bound to such characters as they have practiced in their life. So the picture is that the blessed dead, those who have practiced true philosophy and freed their soul from attachment to bodily things, are able to live with the gods and achieve a kind of release from the bodily existence. Whereas those who have tied themselves so tightly to the pleasures of the flesh are eventually re-imprisoned in the flesh after a period of maybe wandering around as a ghost or wandering around the regions of Hades and so forth. So this is the image that Plato gives us. The souls of the true philosophers are free to live in the heaven of the forms, while the souls of those who live for the body are trapped in bodies that reflect a kind of karmic justice, with gluttons becoming animals like donkeys, and the violent plunderers becoming wolves and hawks, and so on. Page 182, finally, no one may lawfully join the company of the gods who has not practiced philosophy and is not completely pure when he departs from life. And this is why the philosopher is the one who fears death least of all, and why everyone who practices true philosophy would like to follow Socrates in his fate.